Hello, folks. My name is Dawson Vosberg. I'm a doctoral candidate in the Department of Sociology at Ohio State University, and I also run a ramshackle little shindig called the Evangelical Labor Institute, where we talk about ideas of economic egalitarianism and what it means to be a Christian with Orthodox evangelical theology who also endorses an equal economy. So I wanted to talk today because a professor over at Biola of theology named Thaddeus Williams, whose work I've read before and that I've interacted with in the past with regard to his criticisms of egalitarianism and socialism, has recently taken to making some criticisms of Malcolm Foley in his new book, The Anti-Greed Gospel. Now, I would encourage you to go ahead and go read Dr. Foley's book. I think it's a really profound and interesting work that invites you to consider things like lynching, that reintroduces the ideas of Christian nonviolence in a conversation I feel like they've been missing in for some time. But at the core of what Dr. Williams is critiquing is that Foley is one of us. He's an egalitarian with regard to the economy. He's a critic of capitalism, and he would categorize himself as a Christian socialist, which I also would. So what are the criticisms Williams has of the socialism of Malcolm Foley and generally Christian socialism? I don't think the arguments are very compelling. I don't think they've really advanced all that much since the critiques that were in the appendix of his book, Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth. But nevertheless, he's sort of been on a little bit of a tear, publishing little articles, doing interviews, posting podcasts in the wake of the publication of a recorded debate that he had on stage with Dr. Foley in the spring at Preston Sprinkle's Exiles Conference. I've been consuming all of this material. It's a lot to sort of corral and put together. I wanted to mainly answer some of the objections to Christian socialism that Thaddeus Williams brings up because I think they're worth addressing. They're pretty common, but I don't think they hold together very well at all. And I really want to advance the conversation about what do we want out of economic life? What does Christian ethics demand of us? And what is up to our own political wisdom? And what are, in fact, the facts on the ground? That's sort of my area of knowledge, is responding to Christian criticisms of socialism without making you give up any part of your evangelical orthodoxy. So I thought that this would be a good time to both take apart some of these arguments, but also make a bit of a constructive case for Christian economic egalitarianism along the way. So the main place to me where Williams is most confused in his response to the socialist complaint about capitalism is with the claim that capitalism is based on exploitation. So Williams makes a lot of hay about this, and basically it's the grounds under which he says, well, Malcolm Foley is probably wrong about how capitalism works. So what are his answers? There's not a fixed pie of wealth that has to be divided up, but that wealth can grow, and that transactions under capitalism are mutually beneficial and therefore not exploitative. So I'm going to play a clip here.
Put it this way, if I want to be greedy to my core, and I'm in a capitalist society, something crazy happens. I cannot accumulate unless I find something that serves other people. In a socialist context like Cuba or Venezuela, if you want more, you take it through force. In free markets, if I want to get more, I have to provide a good and service to others. So how far has capitalism, which is not the gospel, brought us in 2 centuries, asked McCloskey. The grocer is made better off by the sale of a loaf of bread. So is the woman who earns $8 an hour at Starbucks, spending it on 4 loaves of bread. The grocer then spends his profit maybe on a cappuccino at Starbucks. In any case, he is better off. So is she. The bread buyer is too, or she would not freely buy the loaves. So are the owners of the Starbucks in accepting her offer to work for $8 an hour, and so is she in offering it. So are the customers enjoying their cappuccinos. So exchange in a capitalist market is what economists call mutually beneficial. Mainstream economists, therefore, cannot make sense of the Marxist claim that exchange is exploitation. So what if the whole objection against, say, neoliberal capitalism or the indictments of wealth rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of how free markets work? The false assumption that wealth is a zero-sum game, that wealth is a baked pie. It's the size it is. If I want a bigger piece for myself, I gotta force you to eat a smaller piece. What if that's just not the way markets work?
I think he is confused about the socialist claim about capitalism being exploitative, because these rejoinders are just non sequitur. They're not responsive to the complaint whatsoever. So to see why they don't respond to the complaint, I think we should clarify exactly where socialists say exploitation is happening in capitalism, right? Williams brings up things like, oh, when you last went to the store and purchased something, right? Did anyone have a gun to your back? Was anyone forcing you to do something? Were you doing theft, or were you just being greedy? No. Well, therefore, it's ridiculous to say all of this exchange is just exploitation. But that's not really where socialists are saying exploitation is happening in capitalist economies. It's really in the relationship between labor and capital. So those are very abstract economic terms. So what do we mean by labor and capital? Labor is kind of self-explanatory. It's just the work people do, and the people who do that work. And capital is the stuff we need to make more stuff. And we should zoom in on what we mean by capital, because that's actually where some complexity comes into the mix. Because it's a fancy term for all the productive resources of society. But when we talk about inequality in wealth, we're not talking about differences in consumer spending, right? What people can buy for themselves. We're talking about this control over the stuff that makes more stuff. So you have things like factories, but you also have capital equipment, but you also have things like land, and even ideas can be capital, because ultimately capital is not about the stuff. It's about a social relationship that happens around the stuff. Okay, that's more academic jargon. What do I mean by that? It's not really about I can hold this thing in my hand, right? It's not about having something you can drop on your foot. It's about having a legal claim to something, right? Really, capital is more about that legal claim. And often we can understand this through the fact that most companies are owned not in terms of like, well, Greg owns the mixing bowl and Tommy owns the cash register. We add all of the pieces of the enterprise together and split it up into abstract shares that are essentially not even any longer pieces of paper. They're just lines in a computer somewhere saying this person owns this. And that ownership is what confers power to capitalists. Capitalists being people who own the productive resources of society. Okay, this is what we're talking about with private ownership of the means of production. Basically, the companies, the stuff that makes more stuff, all of that is owned by a very small group of people. So the top 10% owns about 75%. And you can see on this graph, the curve is insanely exponential. There's like basically no wealth in the bottom 50%. A little bit of a rising slope as you get higher, but really it goes vertical once you reach the upper top of the top. Capital then is very concentrated. Very few people own the vast majority of the things that we use to make stuff in society. So where does the exploitation happen? The exploitation happens because capital is concentrated in a small group of hands, right? So this small group of people can take advantage of all the people who don't have any productive property, right? In the old days, in the agrarian societies of the Bible, for instance, people might just have land and they make the things that they need to survive off of their land. Maybe they sell a little extra when they have a bumper crop or something like that. But for the most part, you were subsisting and then doing less formal exchanges with your neighbors. In industrial economies, it doesn't work like that. Either you are a capitalist and you own a good amount, enough to make income to survive on, or you're like most people and you don't own anything that could make you food. So what this shakes out to is the capitalist class, this small group of people who own almost all of the productive resources of society, can take advantage of the majority who are of no property by controlling the terms under which they work. That is, essentially workplaces are organized like a dictatorship for the benefit of the people who own the productive resources, not for the workers. And by having full control over the product of that labor. Once you make something at your workplace, you don't own it. The owner of the company or the shareholders, they control that product. So workers go into their work, they make products, and those products are sold. They're sold for more than the wages of the laborer, plus the cost of the materials and equipment to make it. Okay, so that extra money, how does that get distributed? 100% of it goes to the capitalist or the owners of the firm. None of it goes back to the workers who actually did the labor in creating it. All of it goes to people who have the legal title over the productive resources that were used in that production. It's really important to say they don't work for this. This is nothing they've worked for at all. And in fact, this is a large share of the national income every year. About 30% of national income in the United States goes to people who did not work for it. That is, capitalists, people who just happen to own things and then make money because they own it. This is a problem because ultimately capitalists have an interest in keeping wages lower and keeping workers doing the things that would benefit them the most, not workers, but capitalists. And they have the power to set the rules of the workplace. Workers have a hard time negotiating for a greater share of the production output, basically. So it's that relationship of taking advantage of the fact that people do not own the productive resources of society and getting to set the terms that they work under and being able to take 30% of the national income that results from the work of human beings without having to work for it yourself. That's what we call exploitation. We think that there's a moral problem with that, especially because this ownership is not spread out relatively evenly throughout society, right? People tend to think that, there's a peaks and valleys and whatnot, but ultimately, it's more or less fair. No, it is extremely concentrated. We are sending a third of our national income essentially straight to the wealthiest people every year. So a lot of this ends up getting masked in discussions about socialism by imagining capitalist ownership in terms of the owner-operator model, right? So you have an owner of a firm who's also usually the boss or the executive worker in that firm. So Monique Duson makes exact conflation in her interview with Williams.
When we think of this collective ownership, so that the workers aren't exploited, well, how does that? My question is, how does that work when, as an owner, and I can say this, as an owner, there's a lot more work that I put in than do my employees.
Yeah.
And so for the good of the people, I now need to have my stuff collectively owned. But did the good of the people build what I built?
Yeah, exactly.
So the idea there is, well, I mean, if we're going to own this collectively, I do so much work. Are you going to all of a sudden be able to do that work? I'm worried that you won't be able to manage things as well as I can. Okay, that is a conflation of ownership and management. it is not actually the most common way to organize production under capitalism to have the owner also be a worker. It's far more common in terms of how much production is done under this model for owners and managers to be completely different people. So instead of an owner executive, we have owners who then, through the board, get to choose an executive who essentially have authority over workers. And the executives and the workers, they are doing work to produce the products. But the owners, the shareholders, have no part in the actual doing of production. They're not making anything. They just receive income. What socialists say is, why do we need to have a very small, concentrated class of owners to whom we give the control over how work is managed, as well as the benefits of 30% of national income from production? Why do we need this class of people to be there taking that? Why don't we just make that for everyone? Why don't we make it so that everyone together gets to benefit from and contribute to the running of our industries? So when you just like swap out shareholders for everyone, you're not making that radical a move. You're not going from private individual to big collective. It is in fact a collective group of owners that owns the shares to basically all of the economy, right? No one person owns Apple. It's millions of people concentrated in a small set of hands, but still collectively owned by the capitalist class as a whole. That is how the majority of productive resources are owned in society. It's already collectivized, but it's just collectivized among a small group of the very rich. So that's ultimately what the socialist complaint and the socialist solution is at its core. It's about how we organize production, how we figure out who gets to control and benefit the making of stuff. Why is it a problem that a very small group of people owns nearly all of the wealth? Because we shouldn't imagine that wealth as something like consumer goods. It's not yachts, it's not a house to live in, it's not clothes on your back. It's power over the economy. That's what it is. It is power and a claim to income. Do a very small group of people at the top just inherently deserve, regardless of how hard they've worked in their life, do they deserve to get that much unaccountable power over how the economy is run? Do they deserve to get that much income without working for it? That's ultimately the moral question that socialists ask. So this is why I don't really think Williams is particularly responsive to the claims of socialism, right? No one is debating whether the pie can grow. We all think that the economy can get bigger, right? The question is not whether it can get bigger, it's where does the growth go? Almost all of the growth goes to the top. And this is just empirically the case. We have data from the 1960s, I'll show right here, where in the 1960s we had basically the same shape, it's just a lot smaller. And then you go up to now, and the exact same level of inequality, if not more, is going on. Even though we've grown the pie a whole lot bigger, the share of the pie going to the people at the top is getting bigger, and the share of the pie going to the bottom is not getting bigger. In real terms, the bottom still owns virtually nothing. How big do we need the pie to get for people at the bottom to have meaningful control over parts of the economy? They never will. It's also pretty much irrelevant to say that transactions are mutually beneficial. A transaction can be mutually beneficial and not be just, in part because of its background conditions, right? So if you're approaching a deal between you and like a mafioso, and they're doing a shakedown and they're saying like, if you pay me $500 a month, I'll make sure that nothing happens to your business, right? You mutually benefit. The mafioso gets your $500 a month, and you don't get, beaten up. You don't get your restaurant burned down or whatever. So it's mutually beneficial, but is it just? No one would say that even though that's a mutually beneficial transaction is a just transaction, right? Similarly, the background conditions of capitalism are such that some people have basically all of the productive resources of society. So they have way more leverage in negotiating any relationship between themselves and workers. It's the background condition of productive property getting concentrated into very few hands. That's what we think is unjust and ultimately results in exploitation. And I also want to say, I don't deny that capitalism has produced a tremendous amount of stuff. This is, in fact, one of the oldest things that even Karl Marx said, oh yeah, capitalism is so much better at making stuff than any other system. It's not even funny. That's why we have seen a large number of people in previously very low production countries rising above the sort of $2 a day poverty threshold. I wouldn't get too thrilled about that just because $2 a day is a fairly arbitrary and extremely low threshold. There's a lot of research sort of debating, okay, in real terms, like, is your life that much better above the $2 a day threshold? Can we do better in measuring? Obviously, there have been improvements at the very bottom of the scale. But I don't think that that really has anything to do with whether companies should be organized in a socialist way rather than owned by a very small group of people. Williams is also kind of confused by the term primitive accumulation. He seems to mean that in the sense of primitive as in barbaric, rather than primitive meaning a long time ago historically. So the idea of primitive accumulation is, how did things go from a state of not being owned by anyone to being private property, owned by someone? And the short of it is, you can't get there without someone essentially just snatching it. Someone has to take it against the will of someone else. Because there's no way you can get the agreement of everyone else in the world that, hey, this little corner is mine, and if you step on this little patch of land, I can violently push you out of it or even kill you. That's ultimately what primitive accumulation means. It means that there's no nonviolent, there's no just straightforward transactional way for something to go from not property to being property. And we have real evidence for this being the case. We did not get land privatized in the United States through some sort of Robinson Crusoe situation where you arrive on an empty island. It was soaked in blood through and through. That was how things came to be private property. So this does not mean that current owners of that property are morally culpable for what happened. It just means that any attempt to justify the present unequal distribution of property, referring back to a chain of voluntary, mutually beneficial transactions, that's not tenable, because you run into, well, how did the thing originally come to be owned? It came to be owned through blood and violence. Another thing that Williams is really fixated on is the idea that we're forced to slander the wealthy if we commit to Christian socialism. Because if everything is obtained through greed and theft and whatnot, then I am pretending to have godlike vision into people's wills and into people's intentions that we don't have access to. I don't think this requires any sort of knowledge of the interior states of the wealthy or of anyone else. The complaint that I outlined here is pretty much exactly as true if every capitalist is personally morally virtuous and got their wealth according to the legitimate rules of the game that were established at the time that they got it. Rather, the argument is this: the rules of the game shouldn't give anyone, no matter how personally good they are, huge amounts of unaccountable power over the economy and claim over huge amounts of income from productive processes where they didn't do any work. That power over the economy and claim over the fruits of production is what socialists think is problematic. Not having more consumer goods than somebody else, although, you know, there are some problems with that for sure, especially when we talk about poverty. But it's about the control over what we do with most of our lives, which is work. So Williams is also really keen on emphasizing Marx as the source for these ideas. If you read his World magazine column, he almost feels like there was a challenge at some point to put Marx's name in every sentence, even though Malcolm Foley doesn't really draw that explicitly on Marx at all throughout the book. He put together a supercut of Malcolm Foley talking about Marx from podcast clips and their debate. And my takeaway here is that Foley is not going to bother fighting with being characterized as a Marxist, and he finds there to be some stuff in Marx worth agreeing with. But Marx does not serve as the source for most of his ideas. If you read his book, like half of it is devoted to Christian nonviolence, which is not exactly a Marx concept. Regardless, Williams is really playing up this connection. But I think it's really too much hamming it up, because while Marx was a popularly read figure, he really rose to prominence in the 20th century because the people who did the Russian Revolution were Marx fans. That's why he is elevated as like, oh, this is the real patron of the socialist canon. But a lot of pre-Marx thinkers, including a lot of Christians, had basically every idea that you could say, oh, that's a Marxist idea that I have said so far. One example is an English medical doctor named Charles Hall, who wrote a book in 1805, that's over a decade before Marx was born, articulating basically everything I've said about capitalism and exploitation. But you've got a whole bunch of other people who you don't typically associate with Marx, like Adam Smith. So let me read you this quote from The Wealth of Nations. As soon as the land of any country has all become private property, the landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they never sowed, and demand a rent even for its natural produce. The wood of the forest, the grass of the field, and all the natural fruits of the earth, which when land was common cost the laborer only the trouble of gathering them, come, even to him, to have an additional price fixed upon them. He must then pay for the license to gather them, and must give up to the landlord a portion of what his labor either collects or produces. Right, do you see what's going on here? Somebody can just lay claim to a piece of the world and say, hey, I have the right to get income from this bit of property, from this bit of the world. That happens in land, and it also happens in capital. That is what socialists are complaining about. Adam Smith saw it well before Karl Marx did. And the use of that ownership of productive property to take advantage of workers was also seen by John Locke, sort of the founder of liberal property rights, right? You don't think of him as a big socialist figure, but here's a quote from him. God, the Lord and Father of all, has given none of his children such a property in his peculiar portion of the things of this world, but that he has given his needy brother a right to the surplusage of his goods, so that it cannot justly be denied him when his pressing wants call for it. And therefore no man could ever have a just power over the life of another by right of property in land or possessions, since it would always be a sin of any man of estate to let his brother perish for want affording him relief out of his plenty. And a man can no more justly make use of another's necessity to force him to become his vassal by withholding that relief God required him to afford to the wants of his brother, then he that has more strength can seize upon a weaker, master him to obedience, and with a dagger at his throat, offer him death or slavery. So he's talking exactly about if you have a whole bunch of productive property and your Christian brother does not have any of that productive property, you can't take advantage of that difference to say like, hey, you got to do what I say. That is illegitimate to John Locke for Christian reasons, because, well, if somebody is without the means to make their survival, you just have to give it to them. You can't use that to leverage them into work for you. And if you have problems with the idea that primitive accumulation was essentially theft, when nobody owned something and then somebody seized it for their own, that comes from very early in the Christian tradition. So St. Ambrose of Milan, the teacher of St. Augustine, private property is not a matter of justice, for it is not according to nature, which has brought forth all good things for all in common. God has created everything in such a way that all things are to be possessed in common. So the productive resources of the world, the land, nature, creatures, all of this stuff was a gift to all of humanity from God. So to continue the quote, nature therefore is the mother of common right, usurpation, the mother of private right. So how does anyone take something that previously was given by God to everyone to say like, hey, this is actually mine? They have to take it. It has to be theft, usurpation. So St. Basil the Great, another early church figure, wrote, I am wronging no one, you say. I am merely holding on to what is mine. What is yours? Who gave it to you that you could bring it into life with you? Why, you are like a man who pinches a seat at the theater at the expense of latecomers, claiming ownership of what was for common use. That's what the rich are like. Having seized what belongs to all, they claim it as their own on the basis of having got there first. Whereas if everyone took for himself enough to meet his immediate needs and released the rest for those who in need of it, there would be no rich and no poor. So he's a little more thinking about the goods that you survive on every day, your consumer goods. I think that muddies things a little bit, but I think what he says here is definitely true of productive property, of land specifically, right? That's one place where you cannot grow the pie any bigger. There's only so much earth. There's only so much land. There's only so much space, only so much natural resources, right? So once you take a specific plot of land, that's the only one in the whole world. That spot doesn't exist anywhere else, and you can't make more. And you have no right over it because you didn't make it. That's essentially what these church fathers are saying, is God just gave this to humanity, and to claim exclusive right over it, that you can use violence against someone to exclude them from it, that's illegitimate. So finally, St. Clement of Alexandria. Private property is the fruit of iniquity. I know that God has given us the use of goods, but only so far as is necessary, and he has determined that the use shall be common. The use of all things that are found in this world ought to be common to all men. Only the most manifest iniquity makes one say to another, this belongs to me, that to you. Hence the origin of contention among men. So St. Clement also recognizes that this causes conflicts. Once you have somebody saying like, this part of the world actually that nobody produced, it's going to be mine now, and I'm going to be able to, as Adam Smith said, extract a rent of the land. You have to pay me if you want to use it. That is the cause for a great deal of conflict between the person who claims ownership and the person who is working there. Because like, hey, why? I did the work of gathering the stuff from this land. I did the work of making things in this factory or in this coffee shop. Why do you get a cut? So that's the overall thrust of what I don't think works in Williams's argument, as he just misses the overall socialist critique. But in doing so, he also makes a few other rhetorical moves. And I would say his overall tactic is to frame socialism as an ideology that people latch onto out of ignorance, more or less. They think it sounds good, and it sounds like it appeals to Christian moral values, but they just haven't done their homework. They don't understand how socialism played out in the 20th century. I don't think that's a particularly charitable argument. It's very similar to the argument he made in his book, and I criticized that around when it came out, because there are a lot of people like myself who spent a lot of hours trying to understand this stuff, trying to integrate it with our understanding of Christian faith, and to see, does this comport with orthodoxy? Is this a reasonable thing for an evangelical Christian to believe? And instead of engaging directly with those ideas, he's sort of skirting around it, imputing arguments, reading ultimately what I think is not an adequate version of his opponents. He talks about socialism as a busted blacklight. So what he means by this is that it's meant as a tool of moral investigation to sort of figure out what is just and what is unjust, to show and reveal just injustice that you might not see. But it essentially ignores, the Black Book of Communism, deaths, and the failures of Venezuela and other things of that nature. And there are certainly people who are willing to defend 20th century authoritarian socialist regimes or poorly managed Latin American socialist economies, or people who are just going to say that's not true socialism. I don't think those are either particularly productive arguments. I think it's just simpler to say authoritarianism is bad. You shouldn't have authoritarian control. You shouldn't centralize all of the control into a very small group of people. That's exactly the complaint we have about capitalism. You shouldn't do that and call yourself a socialist government. It's a bad idea. It's also a bad idea to mismanage the economy, right? Doing a good job is better than not doing a good job. But essentially what happens is we pick out contemporary economies that are self-proclaimed to be socialist or organize more socialist that are mismanaged, and we essentially say, oh, that's not socialist for countries that are better managed. Where I, and definitely most of the other people I know who are interested in Christian socialism, where we're really focused on is on equality and democracy and ownership, right? Instead of a small group of people having massive unaccountable control, you spread out ownership to everyone and give everyone a say in how the economy is run. So have we seen places in the world where that exact kind of thing is done, and where socialist ownership doesn't spiral into authoritarian regimes or economic disaster and mismanagement? Yes, we have. It's called the Nordic countries, and everybody rolls their eyes at this point because they think the Nordic countries are really only distinguished by having large welfare states. That's not true. They have massive amounts of socialist institutions. So I'm going to go through a few kinds of socialist institutions that are so large in the Nordic countries and why we actually use those as an example of countries that are extremely prosperous, extremely equal, and also have lots of socialist institutions. So one example is cooperatives. Maybe the biggest example is in Finland. There's a conglomerate of cooperatives called S Corp, and it's a consumer cooperative, which is usually like, well, we got REI or whatever, where the customer is the owner. But for S Group, it's essentially the vast majority of Finnish adults, which is basically the whole population of Finland, more or less owns this together, and it owns hotels, restaurants, banks, and not small ones either, grocery stores. These are like the big, big box grocery stores and home improvement stores, gas stations, hotels, restaurants, things of that nature, all basically collectively owned by the people of Finland. And you can run in elections, you can vote in elections to have a say over the control. The profit gets kicked back to people who are owners of the cooperative. That is an actual socialist institution. It's a little bit on the weaker side to me. I think there are better ways of doing it because you don't capture everyone in the society. Not everybody becomes a part of the consumer cooperative, but it's close enough that I would say that it's a genuinely socialist consumer cooperative. The second is just standard state ownership of a company, right? The country just owns either all of or the controlling majority of shares in a company, and then essentially then democratically elected officials elect a board that works essentially at the behest of the population as a whole. And then the profits from those firms go to the democratically elected process of making a budget with the income of the country. And then finally, there's one more sort of more abstract way of owning productive resources. Some people call it funds socialism. Basically, instead of owning a specific enterprise, a country will own a whole bunch of investment assets, basically. So shares in companies, just like private capitalists might, except they belong to everyone and the benefits go to everyone. So Norway is the country in the Nordics that has done this the most extensively. And so if you put together all of Norway's public ownership, whether it's just regular state-owned enterprises or their massive funds where they own small parts of lots of companies, that makes up 75% of the productive wealth of the country of Norway is owned collectively. We exclude owner-occupied housing because that's not typically what we're thinking of when we're thinking of, productive resources of society. You're not thinking about capital with your house. You're thinking about capital with shares in stocks. And so 3/4 of that in Norway is owned collectively. So what happens to wealth inequality when 75% of wealth is public? So you can see here in the graph, it massively, massively reduces the inequality in wealth. See, private wealth inequality for that, quarter that is still privately owned, private wealth inequality is really high, but you flatten massively the differences between people at the top and the bottom of society in terms of their influence over how production is managed and their benefits from the profits from production. You give that to everybody rather than just the small group of people at the top. And you get that with high prosperity, well-managed, and non-authoritarian governments in countries with very high standards of living where people are happy to live there, even though it's, the miserable dead of winter most of the time. In his interview with Monique Dusan, Dusan and Williams seem really confused by the idea of market socialism. And Thaddeus Williams calls this like a contradiction in terms, but it's not. The Nordic countries are essentially market socialist countries. They still use money and prices to determine what consumer goods are made and how they're purchased and things like that, right? You still go to the store, you still spend money. The difference is not in whether you use money and prices to coordinate consumer goods. It's how are firms owned, right? How are enterprises controlled? Who has a say over what happens in the economy and who benefits from the wealth of an economy? Markets for like consumer goods, even for labor, people going in and getting jobs, those things are not necessarily the problem with capitalism. The problem with capitalism is that relationship between labor and capital being in conflict, and capital essentially being owned by a very small proportion of society. But the other problem of capitalism, I would say, is poverty. And at the end of Dusan and Williams' conversation, they say that socialism is more or less mistaken because it relies on human goodness, right?
Well, who is actually responsible? When it's collectively owned, is the assumption that the collective ownership will be for the good of the organization or the business.
Yeah.
I don't think human nature is like that. We give too much in a socialist structure. We give too much credit to the good nature of the human person. All people are flawed and very sinful. And if I am now putting all my hope and trust in the person who's going to be next to me for our collective good, what if little Tommy lazy?
Essentially, you're banking on a view of human nature that is way too optimistic. You have a liberal high anthropology. In context, I find this to be a bit of a confused argument because Williams hangs a lot on the idea that the rich are greedy and things like that, and that they're exploiting as a cynical argument about, human beings. Like, well, human beings are actually pretty good, etc. But, I don't think those two things hang together. Well, it's socialists are too pessimistic and too optimistic at the same time. But even if we just take it on its own that socialists are too optimistic about human nature in order for their system to work, I think that actually cuts in the literal opposite direction. Socialism, as I've described it here, is about curtailing the ability of people to accrue a huge amount of unaccountable power, and instead distributing that power and benefit from production to the whole of society as a matter of structure, not as a matter of, people feeling nice about it, so they do it. It's just like, this is the new rules of the game, is we own it together. So we recognize that people's motives aren't going to be pure, and you can't just bet on people being morally good to prevent people from exploiting one another. You have to sort of build it into the structure that, you're more or less prevented from getting the amount of power over production that you can take advantage of somebody else who doesn't have power over production. The example I like to give for why I think capitalism is in fact way too optimistic about human nature is the example of poverty. So how does poverty work? Well, the two main ways capitalism distributes income are to workers and to owners, right? You have the 30% of national income that goes to the owners, and presumably the rest of production that gets paid out to workers, right? But there's actually a huge hole. There's a whole bunch of people in society that are just missing from that picture. And in fact, it's about 50% of people are not people who work or people who own. I mean, who are these lazy people not getting a job? It's children, it's the elderly, it's the disabled, it's family caretakers, stay-at-home parents and things like that, people who are temporarily unemployed, and people who are full-time students. Right? That's half of society that gets no income whatsoever from the market. Well, okay, but, they're going to live in households, right? They have families, right? That's the objection. So do families just basically make that problem go away? No, families do not make that problem go away, right? You wouldn't have, if everyone were just on their own and we counted poverty by individuals, you would have 50% poverty there at least. But you don't see 50% poverty, you still see 25% poverty if you just count up wages and profits, right? A quarter of Americans would be poor. And this is not just America. If you look at almost every single country, even the Nordics, you count up all of the wages and all of the profits, it's pretty much a quarter to a third of people who are going to be in poverty. So why is it still 25 to 30%? It's because households are not one-to-one. Even though we have 50% who work, 50% who don't, 50% who earn market income, 50% who earn no market income, our households are not one person to one person, worker and non-worker. It doesn't work like that. You have some households that have all workers, some households have all non-workers, and different mixes and varieties in between. And we don't want, to base people's well-being on, well, do you happen to live with a bunch of non-workers? Because, having children and a stay-at-home mom, that makes you a household with one worker and a whole bunch of non-workers. You're just a lot worse off and much more likely to be in poverty than a family that's like dual income, no kids, right? So the socialist solution to this is pretty simple. You build something called the welfare state. And what the welfare state does is it takes taxes from the income that goes to people who work and people who own, and it distributes some of that income to people who do not work and own. So you have pension plans for the elderly, you have payments for children, you have payments for people who do household labor, care labor, you have student stipends, you have unemployment benefits, you have disability benefits. And if you basically give all of those people an income, you're going to get really low poverty. This is how the Nordics get like sub 10%, 5% poverty, even if they've started at market income, quarter of the population, third of the population in poverty. They bring that way, way, way down by having a big welfare state. And by distributing incomes to people who are in stages of their life where they don't work, and we don't really want them to work. I don't want kids to have to work. I don't want elderly retired people to have to go find a job to be able to survive. But what's the capitalist solution? Well, ultimately, if you don't want to do a little bit of socialism in with your capitalism, you have to pretty much rely on private charity and say, like, it's not really a problem of justice. It's a matter of charity and care. I think those things are not actually at odds with each other, but under capitalism, you basically have to say, well, people just have to be generous and give to other people in order to close that 25% down to a really low level. The problem with that is that it is wildly optimistic about human beings in multiple ways, both in their moral capacity and in their knowledge. It's betting on people just consistently acting against their self-interest to a great enough degree that you bring poverty down to a really low level. I don't think that's particularly likely because human beings do tend to be selfish. And even when they're not selfish, even if you set aside the moral optimism, there's a knowledge optimism that comes with this, that somehow these private individuals all trying to give to other people are just going to know exactly who to give it to. They're going to know exactly what wallets need their income. How are they going to know that? I know a lot of Christians who are very dedicated to reducing poverty by their own giving. And a lot of the conversations in these circles is this anguish of like, I don't know how to do it. Who do you give to? Do you give to this person asking for it on the street? How do you find the right households to pass along your income to in order to reduce poverty? You simply are not going to take any society from like 25% down to like 10, 7, 5% poverty with charitable giving. It's not going to happen. And my evidence is that we have never done it. We have never gotten even close. So just as a bit of numbers here, the poverty gap in the year 2018 was about $511 billion. Now, the poverty gap is the distance between a household's actual income and the poverty threshold, right? How far away are they from that? You add that up for all poor households, and you basically get the amount of money you would need in aggregate to make poverty zero. So that number was 511 billion in 2018. And that same year, all charitable giving, not just charitable giving to one or another kind of cause, all charitable giving in the United States was $428 billion. It wasn't even the full amount of the poverty gap. And that's not just anti-poverty charitable giving. It's like giving to hospitals, giving to art museums, giving to universities, giving to churches to, do worship. All of these things are good. I don't want them to go away. But you would basically need them to go away and then add another, say, $100 billion. And you would somehow need to solve the problem of all of the money goes directly into the right wallets. And also you have no overhead for this to actually be a solution to poverty. It's ridiculously optimistic about human nature, and we have no reason to think that it's actually going to happen that way because we're just nowhere even close. To deal with the realities of human nature, we're not morally perfect. We're going to want to be selfish and hold on to our money. And to deal with the fact that we don't have perfect knowledge, we don't know exactly who needs to be given to as individuals. You have to build a structure that makes sure people get incomes at parts of their life that they're not going to get incomes from the market. So I wanted to wrap this up here by saying I think that there is no automatic, this is the correct Christian political economy to subscribe to. I don't think Malcolm Foley does either. I think that there has been some confusion about that in the discourse, but I would not put on Malcolm Foley that he thinks that, you to be a Christian, you have to then be a socialist. I think that it is a reasonable thing to be a Christian and a socialist based on what I've said. I think it does in fact comport with our knowledge about reality, and I don't think you have to give up anything about being a theologically orthodox evangelical in order to say, hey, capitalism has these specific problems that we can actually solve. I'm not saying this makes a perfect society, and I don't think Malcolm Foley is saying that either. What I'm saying is, I think this is better than what we've got. We can get lower poverty. We can have less concentration of unaccountable power in the hands of a small number of people. But more than anything, I think we should really think about how to have a better debate about this. I feel like I've absorbed almost every argument that Christians make against socialism. I have not seen a new one in a while. And I think it's in part because people have not really engaged with the best stuff that we have to say, right? Even people who are, spending a lot of hours trying to make responses to Christian socialism are just kind of missing the mark in terms of what is it that we're actually saying. So I hope this is a contribution to a better conversation so that we can both be at the same point in the debate. So we can actually talk about, okay, what is the wisdom of the Bible going to contribute to our understanding of how to have a just and flourishing economy? All right. Well, that's all for today. Take care.